Good morning. I hope I'm getting better at the bell. I'm going to hand it over to Tom for just a second. He's got something on the tables. We did another sneak attack. Juvenale's father was not going to be here again today, and we brought in another guest speaker. Some of you may have heard Rich present. I had the pleasure of, actually, Rich dropped in here about 3 years ago. It's been 3 or 4 years as a guest of Bible study. At that point, he was starting a nonprofit, and he's now had some great success with Parish Success Group. And a few of us have had the opportunity to listen to him present. I had the opportunity to travel with him a couple times, and I'm going to see what he does with Parish. I'll tell you all about that. In the meantime, I'll hand over to Tom. He can do his thing, and you can hand over to Rich. I put on the board with invisible ink. Some of these markers are not doing so well. We will not be here next week with it being right after the 4th. Hopefully you'll be all enjoying a long weekend. Some of us are golfing today. We have boots in the car, so shorts work. Pants won't get wet.
Good morning. As you know, I'm a member of Knights of Columbus, 4th degree honor guard. A year ago, I came to you asking for help to find my new uniform. Being an honor guard commander, I felt I had to lead the way. But most of our members are holding off to the last bitter moment. But the moment has arrived. June 30th, Sunday, or Monday, July 1st, the deadline has come. Our members have to buy a new uniform or they can't be part of the honor guard going forward. As I said, in the past, the uniforms cost anywhere from $550 to $600 depending on the tailoring requirements. And that's quite a bit of money to cough up all at once. So what I did, I put a little slip of paper on each table. We did throw up a website, GoFundMe. It's the https:// the 3 W's, GoFundMe.com / and I apologize for the long handle, but it's new-LOA-1199-campaign-fund. We're just starting to develop those sites. I am going to request that we get a domain name that's much shorter, like 1199 Campaign Fund.
Nice.
We'll try that. In the meantime, if you're willing to donate to help out, we have a goal of $22,500. That's what it costs to have our honor guards get the uniform. And mind you, that's only paying half the uniform. The Knights still have to pay $300 out of pocket. And they have to pay the full amount up in the front, bring me a receipt, and then out of our GoFundMe page, we'll fund them half. So we felt it's necessary to do it this way to make sure that whoever's going to agree to be an honor guard member makes a commitment of some sort. This is not a free lunch for us. So we're making that commitment to honor our bishop. Anytime he appears, we are there. Anytime a member has a deceased spouse, whether it's 3rd degree or 4th degree, makes no difference, we will appear at their wake. We will escort the coffin in and out. We're there along with any military service to honor our fallen comrades. So I plead to you to be generous, help us out if you can. I have extra little slips like these. There's only one in each table. I figured if you got your notepad and pencil, you can write it down. But I have some extra ones. I'm going to see me afterwards. I'm meeting all of it. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
It's good to be with you. I'm not going to use this thing because I'm way too much of a pacer to do that. It's good to be with you this morning when Kevin asked me, I don't know how long ago it was, but he had said, hey, before you book another flight, are you available on this one day? And happened to be available. And then he said, oh, and by the way, that's the St. Bernadette golf outing. So thus the first time ever I have presented to a group in a pair of shorts. Because I don't live on this town, so
I don't have time to go home and change and get back, so we're going to support St. Bernadette today as well. So anyway, it's good to be with you. Obviously, I was coming to the Bible study for a long time. I had to stop last fall and become my mom's primary caretaker. Mom had been very sick for a long, long time, and then just kind of started this downward spiral and passed away the week of Easter. And so I wasn't around for quite a while. But it is good to be with you. Just by brief introduction for those who I don't know, and so that you can understand, I guess, why Kevin asked this bald guy to come and be with you this morning, and other than he needed someone to fill the space. So I do run a Catholic nonprofit. It's called Parish Success Group, and what we do is we train Catholic parishes and dioceses and schools throughout the United States and Canada, getting them to grow. And so what we're seeing in our results is double-digit growth in our parishes and in our schools. And so I have coaches all over the country now. We do that. We have satellite offices all over the United States. And so it's, and I used to work for the Diocese of Green Bay. Originally, I'm from Chicago. Don't throw things at me. But I married a cheesehead, and we moved up to Wisconsin to get a little closer to her family. And the Diocese of Green Bay had asked would I come and travel throughout the Diocese of Green Bay, teaching the parishes how to establish youth programs. And then it just became a matter of roughly 10 years ago, I was traveling too much. I was doing too many keynotes around the country, and I wasn't seeing my own family. So I left the diocese and started this ministry, and then that's kind of where I am. And so as far as teaching Bible studies, I love it. I have all kinds of letters after my name that nobody cares about. Nobody knows what they mean anyway. So it is a Bible study. And so I said, Kevin, well, what the heck do you want me to talk about? And so he said, well, given what you do, and given where a lot of people are worried, as far as our church, where are all the young people, where are all the kids and whatnot, and I have a lot of experience in that, and I consult with our bishops on a lot of those issues. I said, well, what if we dug into scriptures a little bit and started looking at this notion of evangelization from the perspective of the behavior of the community and what they were doing. And so what I'd like to do is like to dig into a little bit into the scripture this morning, if you're game. We'll look at the behavior of the early church, and then I have some early church writings that come to us right around the year 200 or so from some of the early Christian communities that describe the behavior. And then what I'd love to do, if we have some time, well, we will have time because I'll make sure we have time, then compare and contrast that life with what we see in the Catholic community today. Does that make sense to you? Are you game? You could always leave and I probably wouldn't notice, so it'll be okay. Excellent. Well, let's dig in this morning. Let's start with prayer this morning. It's a wonderful day. I know it's rainy. I know it's stormy, but God has still blessed us with the great gift of being able to wake up this morning. And so because of that great gift, we give him praise and thanks. And so let's just begin, and we'll just offer our prayer through the intercession of Mary this morning, who oversees all things, in particular for the St. Bernadette Golf Outing, which is a great fundraiser for the parish community here as well.
Rich, can I add just one intention?
Of course you can.
Many of you may know or have known of Father Moses. He's one of the monks that has come from the Holy Resurrection Monastery. And I was meant to mention this before because Rich's mom passed away. Father Moses' mother passed away yesterday. She had been in hospice for about a week and a half, and many prayers for her. But just if we could add her, for you to Holy Mother.
You don't happen to know her name, do you?
Her was Mary.
It was Mary.
Yeah.
Of course it was.
Yeah.
So for Mary, I'm going to presume Moses was her last name, but for Mary, for
it's
her.
very long.
It's a very long name. Let's go with Moses. But for her, for the family, may eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord. May her soul and all the souls of the faithfully departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen. And so let us begin this morning. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary.
Full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So let's dig into this as quickly as possible. Boy, we got a lot of these little loop-de-loop things here. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of take us through a quick summary. Now, you know, I'm not going to repeat a lot of this because I do know that Father Don has covered some of this, but let's start with the most basic one. When people ask about what did the early Christian community do, what did they look like, how did they behave, of course, most of you already know, if you've been coming for any number of time, you know that we did go to the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts immediately follows the Gospels. It's in the book of Acts that we find out what do they do on Monday, right? And all the early weeks and months and years, you go to the book of Acts. And so when you begin the book of Acts, again, I know this is repeat for some of you, so I'm just going to breeze right through this. You know that at the very beginning of the book of Acts, the first thing that you see in the first chapter, is the early Christian community literally gathering together. The apostles were gathering together, and one of the first things they have to do is replace Judas, right? So they figure out how to replace Judas, and then we hear at the end of the first chapter, and as you go into the second chapter, we hear the story of Pentecost, right? We just celebrated that in the last couple of weeks here as a church. We hear the story of Pentecost. It is at the end of the second chapter of the book of Acts. It is a passage that is read over and over and over again. So if you go to the book of Acts, we're going to read through this quick just so that you understand, then we're going to break down what exactly some of the highlights of that passage are. So it's verse 42 of the second chapter of the book of Acts. This same passage, as you may also know, because I do know Father Don has covered this many, many times, is repeated again in the fourth chapter. You hear a very similar story repeated again in the fourth chapter. But we hear about the communal life. So when they gathered together, what the heck did they do? And how did they behave? Okay? Because that's what we really want to dig into. So in the book of Acts, second chapter, verse 42, and it's going to go all the way to the 47th chapter. Okay? So there's just 5 verses here. And then I want to process these 5 verses. We read, "They devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles and to the communal life, to the breaking of the bread and to the prayers. Awe came upon everyone, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. All who believed were together and had things in common. They would sell their property and possessions and divide them among all according to each's need." Bless you. "Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple area." Remember, that's Jewish, so they went public. "And breaking bread in their homes." As you know, again, those of you who come to the Bible studies, you know that's the first time we begin to see Catholic liturgy come together, right? First half of Catholic liturgy is really Jewish in origins. Second half is post-Jesus. "They ate their meals with exaltation and sincerity of heart, praising God and enjoying favor with all the people. And every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved." So that's the story that we hear when we dig into Scripture. And I know you've heard this before, you've read this before. Many of you, Father Don has covered this many times because I've heard him talk about it many times. So when we say, okay, there's a lot of highlights in there, and I just want to point out a couple of them to you. And the reason I want to do this is because when we start to look at what's happening today in our church, it's important to understand that how is it that a community that, of course, at that time they didn't call themselves even Christians at that time, at the time of this passage, but nevertheless, how did this community, which will be persecuted and put to death, often publicly, how did they continue to grow? Yet today, when we don't have any of that, we can't get people to come to church. Because that just doesn't make sense, right? Especially in this country. Now, there are parts of the world, Christians are still very much being persecuted today, but not here in the United States. And so we can't get people to come, and they couldn't keep people away. Doesn't that sound odd? Like, that just doesn't make sense. And so that's what I want to dig into that. So here's a couple things that we realize just from those 5 verses. Number 1, a devotion to biblical, we would now call biblical teaching. It was a devotion to the apostles and the apostles' way of life. That for the early Christian church, doing what we do here, digging in, studying, sharing about the stories, trying to learn, because of course there was no catechism, so they had to figure these things out, and that would of course evolve over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, multiple councils and so forth, right? So they devoted themselves to the teachings. Eventually, as you also know, they would start to write these things down, right? That would come, and they would write these down because people were dying off. Number 2, they devoted themselves to the community, to fellowship, to gathering together. That it was critically important for this community that we spend time together, that we know each other. Now, an important thing to point out, if you know anything historically about what was going on at that time, is that this early fragments of a Christian community looked very different than the way that they were living in their secular world. Men, of course, it's a patriarch society, so it was common that men could have relations with as many women as they wanted, and we know that the women would be the ones that were considered at fault, right? It was common to kill children for many reasons. Not that I'm totally simplifying this for you, just so you know. But to kill your offborn, or your firstborn, especially if it was a girl, was not unusual. This notion that when a man would die, well, just get rid of her and let her go out in the streets, which of course that was a big part of Jesus' ministry. That was the whole reason why Jesus made sure that he saved his mother on the cross, right? When Jesus is hanging on the cross and he said, looks to John and he says, behold your mother, it wasn't, I mean, yes, it's the beginnings of the church, but let's be honest, Mary's about to become a widow, an orphan, and has no home, which means she has no rights, which means she was going to be thrown out. So even dying on the cross, Jesus saves his mother, right? So that's the community. This community would look and behave differently. That we will gather everybody together and we will take care of each other. That in of itself was different. And they said it's critically important that we spend a lot of time together, always doing the prayers and studying the scriptures. 3, we hear in that passage, they devoted themselves to sharing everything. Now today we have fancy words for that in the church, we call it stewardship. But their level of stewardship was not our level of stewardship. Their level of stewardship was anyone that was in need anywhere. We will not only give of our excess, we will give even when we don't have excess. Because that's what we were commanded to do. And so it was more than just taking people into your home. It was, let me help you establish your own life, and you just take mine. Well, you only have one couch. Don't worry, just take my couch anyway. There was no counting of the cost. That's Paul's writings, right? Do not count the cost. And Paul, of course, got it from Jesus. There was no counting the cost of what we give away. That was radically different. Because in the early community, under Roman law, every penny mattered. Because every penny was taxed. Right? And you know this. I'm repeating some of this. You already know this. They devoted themselves to prayer, and they devoted themselves to constantly praising God. Again, completely different than what the early world, the early Roman culture ever had seen before. As I'm going to share with you in some of the early writings here in just a little bit, around the year 200, now we're well into persecution. They praised God always. Whether a baby was born, whether someone died, they would praise during the funerals, during the ceremonies. They would sing and dance and praise God among all things. When they were being persecuted, they praised God. And the people in the community were looking like, what's wrong with these idiots? Don't they know what's happening? Thus the joy, right? It was infectious joy. That our life is so blessed. We have no need to cling to anything. That, when someone's down on their luck and maybe food or clothing or a home was destroyed, and the whole community would joyfully, just take mine. Don't worry about it. Take mine. It's all good. And like hawks, they would watch out for those in need. Because that's the way the Lord had trained them. Correct? Now, this notion of then proclaiming this message about why they live this way, see, that's the proclamation of the gospel that Jesus spoke about. Why do you live this way? Well, let me tell you the story. Right? Now, the early notions of evangelism did not start with the disciples. Right? Because technically, we were evangelizing in the Old Testament with Moses. Because Moses, we'll see in Exodus, in the 19th chapter of Exodus, we see that Moses gets the commandment about how the Israelite community is the chosen people. Right? So let's go to that. Let's go to the 19th chapter of Exodus. I got to stand in front of the camera, that's right. Sorry, I told you I was a pacer. I'll pace this way. I'm trying to avoid that little post that's right there.
Yeah.
Let me hit down the middle. The 19th chapter of Exodus. We're going to be in the 3rd verse, so it's right at the beginning. We'll give it a second for people to find that. And we're going to read all the way through the 8th chapter. And this is going to make sense. Yeah, I can't do Father Don's joke of what page are you on. This is going to make sense then. If we understand this, it'll make sense why the early church also had so many arguments in their evangelization. All right, are we pretty close? All right, so in the 19th chapter of Exodus, this is what we read. Follow along. So Moses went up the mountain, we're talking about Sinai, went up the mountain, and then the Lord called to him and said, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, Tell the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves how I treated the Egyptians, and how I bore you up on eagle's wings and brought you here to myself. Therefore, if you hearken to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my special possession, dearer to me than any other people, though the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. That is what you must tell the Israelites. So Moses went, he summoned the elders of the people. When he set them before them all, he told them what the Lord had said. So now you have an early Christian community. This is where we're going to get into conflict. The first fight of the church was not over whose closet should that be. It was for all these years, everybody thought that the whole mission of God in the world was for the Israelite nation. This is why, we don't have time to get into all this, but this is why even the early disciples struggled with a lot of Jesus' behavior. Why are you talking to remember the woman at the well? And they came back and they're like, why are you talking to her? It's because for them, it didn't even logically make sense. Because the only people that mattered were the Israelites. Pentecost is important in this story because for the first time, it publicly became about everybody. And the mission of the church was no longer kept just for the prophets who were selected by God, but now everybody would be a prophet. Everybody was a messenger. Everybody who was now a part of the community was to go save everybody, regardless of who they were. So the early notion of evangelization that the Israelite nation would have known got completely flipped upside down on its head. This is why we continue to read. We don't have time to do this morning. You continue to read in the book of Acts that a lot of the early disciples started to have arguments with each other. Well, are we Jewish or are we something else? Do we start a new religion or do we stay as we are? They didn't know because there was no roadmap. The Spirit was to help them discern what they were to do. That's an important piece when we talk about today. So that's why I'm highlighting some of these important pieces. We fought because many of the church were clinging to the only way we knew church. What happened after the Second Vatican Council? Did we all get along and everybody like, this is great, let's go for it? Of course not. Not because we were bad people. Some were totally for it. Some said, yeah, so Mass in the vernacular, why didn't we think of this earlier, right? But others, by the way, including still today, still say that was the worst thing we ever did. Correct?
Yes.
Because it's our way of knowing God, not because people are bad, not because people are mean. The Israelite nation wasn't mean. It was because this is what we know here. This is the way we have behaved for years. To disrupt that changes our whole way of understanding God, and we don't like change. As Father Chris pointed out last week, for those of you who were here, what was the first thing that the Israelites did, many of them, not all of them, when they went out to the desert after being enslaved? What did they want to do? Go back. Why in the world would you go back to slavery? Was it because they liked it? No. It was because it was familiar. There's a comfort in the familiar, even if we know it's not working. Does it sound familiar? And when we know it's not working, and prophets come to say there's a better way, what's the first thing we do? Kill the messenger. Right? When people talk about the challenges we're facing as a church today, are we really in any different place than in truth? Digging into Scripture, we have been many, many, many times before. It's not that God has abandoned us. It's not that the church is dead. It's not that the covenant expired in 2018 and we haven't figured it out yet. It's that God's holy people are struggling to understand the only way they have known their God. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Isn't there some comfort in knowing we're not the first ones to go through this? But it's important to look back on that. It's important to say, then what do we know about what was essential? And that's why we started with the book of Acts. Because there was a recipe, even in the midst of persecution, to grow the church. So with that said, and we could, oh my gosh, I could dig into this all day long, but of course, because we got to get the nice uniforms in here, let's dig into a couple of these. I'm going to hold off on the Corinthians one because you know Corinthians is the basis of the Christian community, early Christian community. Let's flip. I just want to do a couple real quick passages about the early life and the instructions of Paul to the early life. So let's go to Philippians first. Let's go to Philippians 1, and we're going to go to verse 27. So take your time, find it there, and we'll figure out. And we're going to read some of the instructions You know this, I'm preaching to the choir, but just in case we have visitors, I always like to repeat. Paul wrote all these letters because, of course, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phones and all those things. So Paul was writing, Paul was a motivational speaker, technically Paul's scribe, because Paul didn't write them, Paul's scribe wrote them. But Paul was a motivational speaker, and Paul was always writing to all these Christian communities spread throughout the Mediterranean area to encourage them to stay true to what we have come to know. Okay? And so in 1 Philippians 27, this is one of the letters to the people of Philippi. That was the name of the town where the Philippians lived, was Philippi. And so this is what he had written. We're only going to read 27 to 29. We can do this all day if we wanted to. Only conduct yourselves in a way worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I'm absent, I may hear news of you. Word would spread. That you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, struggling together for the faith of the gospel, not intimidated in any way by your opponents. Boy, wouldn't that be great to hear today? Not be intimidated by this secular world. Stand firm, right? This is proof to them of destruction, but of your salvation. Not of destruction, but of your salvation. And this is God's doing. Meaning there must be some original plan here. For to you has been granted, for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer with him. Real quickly, I want to flip just back a few pages. Let's go to Ephesians. It should, in your book, only be 2-3 pages back. Ephesians 5. Excuse me, the end of 4. The end of 4. And we're going to read starting at verse 25. And again, he's speaking to a different community. Right? Now it's the Ephesians instead of the people of Philippi. But here's what he says in the 25th verse. Therefore, put away falsehood, speak the truth, each one to his neighbor, for we are members of another. Be angry, but do not sin. It's okay to get upset. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun set on your anger. Speaking to the community of the critical need to forgive. Don't go to bed angry at your spouse. That same notion, right? And do not leave room for the devil. The thief must no longer steal, but rather labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with one in need. That is so important in the discipleship journey. How can you lead someone out of their pain if you have spent no time struggling with your own? Who is the most credible witness to one struggling in life? The expert who is perfect, or the one who shares their own struggles and knows their own imperfections? Right? It's just basic psychology. Paul is encouraging the people, not only it's okay to struggle, it's okay to get angry, it's okay to disagree.
Rely on other people's stories.
But don't pretend, don't believe that we are perfect. In fact, share your struggles with the rest of the community. It's okay to say we're worried about what's happening to the church. But don't go to the level of sin that says it's hopeless. That God cannot redeem the church that he created. And do not sin and go to the place of saying that we know the answer to save the church. Who saves the church? Christ. There is no one today that has all the answers. There is no one place that all wisdom resides. The church has always known that. I share that because as someone who has worked intimately inside, or as I like to call, in the bowels of the organization, spent some time there. We like to chase shiny pennies. The next great marketing campaign or program or Bible study or CD or whatever it is that comes along, everybody wants to chase because that's what's going to save the church. That's falsehood. Always has been, always would. It does not mean that it does not have value. But when everybody runs for the one thing, you have forgotten who's going to save this church. Christ will save this church. And what we also know about the community, the early community in Paul's writings, was this. Wisdom comes from anywhere. Wisdom comes from anywhere, including the children. That's unfathomable to a lot of grown-ups. Is it possible today that the young people, those heathens that they are, who are self-absorbed, totally into their technology, sexually promiscuous, addicted to so many things, except apparently not relationship, have no interest in church, is it possible that they could save the church? Could the Lord use them and not us to save the church? As Jonah looks out on Nineveh, even this community, Lord? Really? Is there good here? Isn't that kind of where we are today a little bit? When I travel all over the United States, most people have already written off most of our young people because we don't see them. They're not in our churches, which by the way is true. Statistically speaking, that's true. We're under 19% now of people who are under the age of 20 are actively attending church. And included in that 19% are the kids who are being forced to come by their parents. We know today, because of the data that's out there, we're studying this generation more than we've ever studied. We know that today, that the average age when a child consciously chooses that I have no interest in the Catholic Church is what? 13. I've made the conscious choice, I'm done with this thing called Catholic. I may still go because my parents are making me go, so that's still continuing. But we know that it was between the ages of 10 and 20 that the vast majority of people who were, there's all this research that's out there. The most recent one was conducted by St. Mary's Press in conjunction with the Lilly Foundation. They wrote it in a book called Going, Going, Gone. The overwhelming majority walked away disaffiliated with the church between the ages of 10 and 20, and the average age was 13, which meant there were a whole lot closer to 10 than there was to 20. But here's the irony. Why were they walking away from the church? They didn't know what they were walking away from. That's true. From an adult's perspective, because they don't know that they're uncatechized because they don't know what that means. But we would look at it and say, they don't know what they don't know, right? Well, whose fault is that? Parents. Are the parents catechized? No, by the way. The vast majority. following the Second Vatican Council, when we shifted things around, and suddenly it was lay people that were teaching catechesis, do you know that the active engagement level with those kids dropped all the way to 33% when it used to be 87%? Well, who are all those kids back then? Today's parents. So, that's the first thing, by the way, even when I sit with all the bishops at the bishops' conference, that's the first thing out of my mouth. And I say, well, the easy answer would be to blame the parents, but are the parents catechized? Do the parents know what they don't know? So whose fault is it? Now, we know it's not the church's fault. But if you think of it in this way, we still teach in a way, we don't have time to get into this. This is a whole other day for a whole other topic. We still teach the way that we taught, the way we taught 50 years ago. We are still in a classroom model of formation today. Except now we have volunteer catechists who themselves have very limited training. And vast majority of whom are not even teachers themselves. So now they don't even understand adolescent development. And by the way, that doesn't get trained into them. It's just get through the textbook. So the only training they get is however to do the lesson plan. We have former teachers in here. Is that a highly effective way to form the next generation? Use people who don't know how to teach, who have no formal training in it, and who themselves barely know the subject. And then wonder why we continue to lose the next generation. Right? Anyway, we can cover that all day long. But I do want to show you one thing, because I still, in the midst of all that, I still believe in hope. I want to point a couple things out to you. The first thing we're going to do is a passage you all know. Let's go to Corinthians. Let's go to 1 Corinthians, the passage you hear. If you've ever been to a wedding, you've probably heard it 16,000 times. 1 Corinthians, but it's an important piece to understand what we need to begin to look like. The 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians is where we hear the very famous passage that is, spoken of in so many different weddings and so many different places. It's this notion of love. All of Paul's writings, when they speak of the early church, they speak of this notion of they just love each other. They love each other. Well, what the heck does that mean? Right? I mean, do they just hug? Is that considered love? What does love look like? That's why we go to 1 Corinthians. Because it's described for us the behavior of love. And that's important. So the 13th chapter, I'm going to read it a little bit quick because I know the vast majority of you in here are very familiar with this. If I speak in human and angelic tongues, but I do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can command all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but I do not have love. Now, I just want to pause for a second, because think about that. Paul is even recognizing that it's possible to be a charismatic Christian preacher who has the faith to take on big initiatives, to do great things, but still might not know what love is. You ever thought about that? That Paul has opened the door to recognizing it's possible that the loudest prophetic voice doesn't necessarily mean that they understand love. And sometimes we just skip over that. I don't want to skip over that because that's important. You've heard it said here, Father Donna has said it here. Just because you go to church, just because you go to adoration, doesn't mean you know the Lord. You may know about the Lord, but knowing about the Lord and knowing the Lord are not the same thing. Does that make sense? And Paul opens the door to this notion. Because it's not what you say, it's what you do. Have you ever heard a young person say that? Don't tell me, show me. Young people don't care what comes out of our mouth. They're watching our behavior. Right? That's why I wanted to hit pause right there. Because Paul opens the door to reminding us of that. If I give away everything I own, and if I hand my body over so that I may boast, but do not know love, I gain nothing. You could be involved in all the service projects that you want, but if you don't know love, if you're doing it for self-gratification, you might know about the Lord, you're wearing his jersey, you might be on his team, but you live far from his heart. Does that make sense? Because here's the behavior of love. Love is patient. Love is kind. It is not jealous. It is not pompous. It is not inflated. It is not rude. It does not speak of its own interests. It is not quick-tempered. It does not brood over injury. It does not rejoice over wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Thus, the early community, why they could put up with all this. But we're not bound by stuff. You can burn our stuff. I'm not bound by stuff. I'm bound by something greater. Love never fails. If there are prophecies, they will be brought to nothing. If tongues, they will cease. If knowledge, it will be brought to nothing. For we know partially, and we prophesy partially. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. And then he goes into this notion of the image of being a grown-up in the faith. He's not talking about age. When I was a child, I used to talk like a child, think like a child, reason as a child. When I became a man or woman, I put aside childish things. It's this notion of growing up. Time to stop controlling. Time to let go and understand. Now, real quick, I want to share with you a couple writings from the early church to help put in this perspective. And then maybe we can have a little dialogue or questions or whatever you want to do to talk about what it means today. In the early church, there were lots of writings. Of course, everything didn't make it into this nice little book that we call the Bible. But we see an awful lot of writings from early church leaders and observers of church leaders that have been preserved. One of the greatest things to prove Christianity, you know this part of the story because I've heard Father Don speak of it, is that actually the Dead Sea Scrolls was one of the greatest things that actually helped prove our case, because they found all this stuff and it really just confirmed what we've been saying the whole time, right? And so they found an awful lot of old writings and writings that had been preserved. So I'm just little excerpts from a couple of these writings. Now you got to remember, this is not when Paul's around. They didn't even know Paul. This is several generations later, because nobody lived to be 100 then, right? Tertullian was he was in North Africa. He's a well-known early Christian writer. They believed that he was a lawyer. He was well-educated. And he wrote extensively about the early Christian church. It would have been written somewhere in the late 190, 200, 210, right around that time period. This is how he describes the community that was living at that time. Remember, they're in deep persecution at this point. We are a body knit together as such by a common religious profession, by unity of discipline, and by a bond of common hope. We meet together as an assembly and congregation, and by that bond of common hope, we offer up prayer to God as with united force we may wrestle with him in our supplications. I like hearing that, by the way. I don't know why. It brings me comfort to know they wrestled with God. This strong exhortation God delights in. We pray too for the emperors. Wait a second, now that's the people who are persecuted. And he writes about openly, we pray for them. For their ministers and for all in authority. For the welfare of the world, for perseverance of peace, for the delay of the final consummation. Dognetes, it was an epistle that was written again roughly the same time. It's kind of a little lesser known, but not of the Christian. It was an observation of the Christian community. Here's what they write. They love all men, even though they are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death, but believe they are restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of most things, and yet seem to abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonorment, they feel glorified. Isn't this fascinating to listen to how someone's observing the Christian community? I love this stuff. They are evil spoken of, yet are justified. They are reviled by some, but they bless them. They are insulted and repay that insult with honor. They do good, even though they will be punished as evildoers. When punished, this is fascinating. When punished, they rejoice as if it was quickening their life. They are assailed by Jews as foreigners, are persecuted by the Greeks, yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know if you ever read stuff from back in that period, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me anyway. Maybe I'm just a dork who works for the church, and that's why it's fascinating to me. But you know the whole thing about giving to one another. I want to read another one by Tertullian here. This is about giving to the needy and charity. And so he speaks, he's describing their community, and he says, though we have our treasure chest, it is not made up of purchase money, as of a religion that has its price. Now remember, you were obligated, the early church, you were obligated to give your tithe, right? On the monthly day, if he likes, each puts a small donation, but only if it be of his pleasure and only if able. There is no compulsion, all is voluntary. These gifts are not spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means or parents, and of old persons confined now to their homes.
Now we're done.
Did you say now we're talking? Such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons, for nothing about their fidelity to the cause of God's church, they become nurslings of the confession. They are our family. I want to compare and contrast that in the last couple minutes we have to observations here about why millennials are leaving the church. I was part of a bunch of large studies, okay? And I'm just going to read you the highlights here. We can get into stuff. When they studied these millennials, these people who are born in the 90s and into the early 2000s, right? These are today's teenagers and young 20-somethings. Here's what they found. Millennials do not want to be preached at, they want to be mentored. Millennials, as one says, crave relationships. To have someone walk beside us through the muck. We are the generation with the highest ever percentage of fatherless homes. We're looking for mentors who are authentically invested in our lives and in our future. If we don't have real people who actually care about us, why not just listen to the sermon from the couch? It's an interesting observation, right? But if you're relying on that to drive millennials into your church, it's not going to work Because if I'm struggling with fear today, I can sit at home in my sweatpants and hear 50 sermons on a podcast about fear. Yes, keep preaching it and teaching it, but come around us. Teach me how to live this out. These are words of millennials, by the way. This hopeless generation that wants nothing to do with the church. Another reason cited of being over the church is that they're sick of hearing about values and mission statements. As one millennial wrote so this study I was a part of was quantitative and qualitative. It was both fill out the survey, but it was also one-to-one interviews. I probably should have started with that. Stop wasting time, this is what one says. Stop wasting time on religious mumbo-jumbo and get back to the heart of the gospel. When I see you doing what you say, we will come. Compare and contrast anything from what we heard about the early church, behavior, and what we talked about all morning. We love mission statements. Man, I'll tell you, we love them. Most people can't recite theirs, but we love to spend months discerning them. While many churches schedule countless church-type activities such as Bible studies, social function, planning meetings, very little time is devoted to helping the poor or the less fortunate. Or at the very least, it is not nearly the priority that getting everybody to a Bible study, social function, or planning meeting seems to be. The young people are watching our behavior. They do not care that we speak in angelic tongues and have great prophecy. They could care less how much we know. They want to know, do you actually believe? When will we do what we say? Today's young generation, I can speak, I'm just conscious of time, so today's young generation wants a place in the church. They really do. There's plenty of data to support that. Now, they would define church differently because they don't know what they don't know. That's true. They're not leaving because they're anti-parent. That's not true. They're leaving because they don't understand this community. You ask me and put me into a classroom on a Wednesday night where I never see the adult community, and then ask me to be a part of the adult community that I don't know. And when I do go, and what I do see is the church always fighting the world. That's what the young people continue to say over and over and over. Not teaching lovingly about a different way to live your life, but fighting the world in the way it's living its life. Young people are not mad at the church because we believe in chastity. Young people are mad at the church because we're screaming at them for not knowing how to live chastely. Now go back to Paul's writings. Go back to the early church. When someone is received in love, when do young people get to just be? 2 years ago, I was with the U.S. Bishops Conference down in Orlando. It was the first time in 100 years they had gathered every diocese in the country. And they asked me to come down there, and I presented to them on what's going on in our parishes. And I just said, I can't speak to every parish. Obviously, I haven't been to every parish. I don't have a clue what's going on in every parish. And even that, you could go to all four corners of the country, and it's all different in all four corners of the country. But here's what I do know. We are obsessed with answering questions that aren't even being asked. Before anyone's even asking them. And want to avoid just being with people. You may or may not have heard that over the last couple of years, Pope Francis had this little synod on youth and families. And there was a special synod on youth that took place last October. And they released the writings, just came out like 2 months ago. The writings were the same. I know many of the people that were over there, I was not able to make it over myself. I would have killed them. I would have given my left leg to go over and be a part of that. But I couldn't be there, so it was fine. But I read all the writings. I was a part of some of the advanced work going over. And here's the irony of the whole thing. Young people just want to be listened to. And yet when we approach young people, the first thing we want to do is teach. Because young people apparently have nothing to offer us. What if we would just sit and say, talk to me about your world? What if all of the adult ministries in all of our parishes, I know everyone doesn't go to St. Bernadette, but whatever parish you're a part of, what if all the ministries that we're a part of, what if we would go to our young people and get involved and ask them to teach us instead of sticking them in a classroom on a Wednesday night? Especially considering 50 years ago our church wrote that the way that we're actually to form young people is an apprentice-based model, not depository of fact model. I'm quoting out of the church document. And yet, today, we're still in a classroom textbook model, even today. The young people, what did the young person say? Without them ever realizing, because they don't know what they don't know. What did they say? What model were they asking for when they said, we want someone to guide us and explain how to use this? What would we call that? Apprenticeship. They don't know that they're asking for what the church told us to do 50 years ago, but that's what the church told us to do 50 years ago. Does that make sense? Was this fun?
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time. I know we hit 7:30 here, and people got to get going, and some people got to go practice their golf swing before they shoot 143. So, thanks for coming out. I hope this was fun. Kevin, thanks for the invitation to join us.